And what Slavoj tells us in a number of his publications is that the way Hegel radicalized Kant by getting rid of the thing in itself is also the way that Lacan radicalized Freud. So that the unconscious in Freud is in some sense a real thing, a quasi-biological entity that's there, hidden beneath appearance. For Lacan, that's not really true. The unconscious occurs in the gaps and ruptures on the surface. There's not really a hidden place where the unconscious is. Now, what I would say is that neo-modern philosophy radicalizes Kant in the wrong way. It tends to say that the problem with Kant, this great genius, is that he allowed for finitude, this idea that humans cannot reach the thing in itself because we are only experiencing according to space-time and the 12 categories of the understanding, and so we can never get at the thing outside there. And the neo-modern philosophers tend to try to get rid of this finitude, which they distrust. I would go the other way. I think the finitude is insurmountable. I think the problem with Kant is that he left the human-world relation at the center of philosophy, and it's the only real relation he can talk about. Kant doesn't really allow you to talk about the collision of two inanimate entities, except insofar as we are talking about it, and therefore the conditions of human experience apply to discussing that. So I think what should have happened is people should have said Kant is a genius precisely because of the finitude. He just shouldn't have reduced it to the human-world gap, so that we poor humans can't reach the end itself. It's a problem of the subject, of the human being. For me, the same problem happens when inanimate objects collide. To take the old example from Islamic philosophy, when fire burns cotton, the fire is not making contact with all the properties of the cotton, but only with a caricature or a translation or a distortion of the cotton. And so there's no direct contact possible in the inanimate world either, and so the same problem that happens in the subject happens in the inanimate world as well. This is one of the central principles of O, as we call object-oriented ontology. So if you want to speak about this counterfactually in terms of the history of philosophy, instead of a German idealism, there could have been a German realism at that same moment that took the path I've just sketched. And it was quite plausible because German philosophy at the time was very much under the influence of Leibniz, and Leibniz also allows for this world of non-human things mirroring each other and reflecting each other. This could have happened. So in a way, O is just trying to create German idealism 200 years after it first could have been born. All right, now realism. This is another probable difference between us. I know Slavoj doesn't like being called an idealist always, but he certainly wouldn't call himself a realist, I don't think. Realism is sometimes also called naive realism, as if there were other kinds, according to these critics. They think all the realism is naive. And this means, according to them, the idea that there's a reality outside the mind, that the mind has nothing to do with constructing. I think that's the wrong way to define naive realism. I think naive realism is the kind of realism that thinks there's a world outside the mind and I can know it. That's the first problem, because I think the real is so real that it cannot be known. It can be gotten at indirectly. It's not completely inaccessible, but it's inaccessible only through what I call allure. Something is summoning you, something is drawing you, with aesthetics being a very clear case of that. Something is summoning you without being directly accessible. That's one problem with what they call naive realism. Adrian Johnston, who among many other things is one of the best interpreters of Slavoj that we have, claims that I will be left with nothing but negative theology if I take this path. But that assumes that there's only two options. You either know something or you don't. Whereas this is what is called Meno's paradox. This is what Socrates criticizes, the idea that you already know something or you don't. I think the truth is that we are somewhere in between those. And this is the foundation for philosophia in the Greek meaning of it, that it's a love of wisdom. You never attain the wisdom. You're always somewhere in between there. And I think also this is what aesthetics is about. Aesthetics is not a kind of knowledge any more than philosophy is, and this holds for architecture as well as the arts. You obviously make use of knowledge in architecture, just as we do in philosophy, but you are not primarily producing knowledge. That's a side effect in most of what you're doing in architecture. You're producing something else. You're producing something that's not ever fully knowable, not ever fully paraphrasable in literal terms, in terms of you can say literally what the 25 qualities of this building are. You can try that, but it's never going to work. So aesthetics is very central for O. And how am I doing on time, Anna? Fine? Okay. Here's another problem I have with naive realism. People always say realism is the view that something exists outside the mind. Who says that the mind is the only thing with an outside? There's an outside also when two objects interact. And I say that there's a reality outside of that interaction. When the fire burns the cotton, there's a cotton outside of what the fire interacts with. And so realism is something that affects not just us, something outside our mind. It implies also something outside of objects when they interact. So objects translate each other, just as we translate them. Alfred North Whitehead got a glimpse of this in his wonderful sort of throwback philosophy in the 1920s, but Whitehead for me is too relational. He reduces objects to their relations with other things, whereas O is all about the irreducibility of objects to their relations.